ever since 1965 when IBM, for the very first time, withheld the source code when they delivered their computers to their customers. Interesting enough, a historic footnote in the technology industry, prior to 1965, IBM used to distribute source code to all of the programs that it delivered to its customers.
Let me ask you, what do you think currently is the biggest problem with open source?
I don't think there is one, to be honest. In that any technology model takes many years, literally decades, to become the dominant model. So in the early 1970s, everyone saw the mini computer becoming the dominant architecture. It wasn't for another full decade until the mid-80s that had become true. In the same thing was true with personal computers, that personal computers gave their buyers and the users within corporations a freedom they hadn't had, because prior to the personal computer they were beholden. They were controlled by their own computer department in their organization. But again, the personal computer started, Jobs and Wozniak were working in their garage in the late 70s. It wasn't until the mid-90s that the personal computer was the de facto way to deploy computers. Most of 15 years. Well, open source really only started getting some traction in the mid-90s. We're now only 9 years later, and we're beginning to see the consideration of open source for every application. We're seeing governments deploy it, we're seeing banks deploy it. Another 10 years from now, people will forget that in the early 90s, you couldn't get source code for the technology that you were building your organization around. You were completely dependent on the vendor, and people are going to shake their heads and wonder who allowed that model to exist.
Now, Bob, when you started Red Hat, where were you in the race in the distro market?
Well, keep in mind, this was a trivial industry. What we all understood, ourselves and the guys at Caldera and Pat Volkerding at Slackware, is none of us were making enough money to survive. So it wasn't a question of Red Hat, sort of taking market share from Patrick, or Patrick taking market share from Caldera, or Caldera taking market share from Yggdrasil. It was we had to grow the market, because the market at the time, this is in now 94, 95, was so small that none of us could keep bread on the table, much less, sort of look forward to a retirement. But nonetheless, when we started, we were by far and away the smallest. Yggdrasil and Slackware were the two dominant distributions at the time.
Now, what advantages does Red Hat have over other distros?
Today, I can't actually answer that question for you. If you've noticed, my hat is a Lulu hat. My contribution to Red Hat was as the entrepreneur. What I do, as a business guy, what gets me out of bed in the morning is trying to identify holes in the marketplace, and then trying to figure out how to build a product or service to solve that hole, to serve those customers. My failing, this is now personal failing, is that I have a really low threshold for boredom. Okay, I get bored really, really easily. And the problem with that, well, the benefit of that failing is, as an entrepreneur, it's perfect. Because as an entrepreneur, you have no idea what you should do when you get up in the morning. And having a desire to learn new things and to solve new problems is a real benefit. The problem is, in a large company like Red Hat, who now has, 800 people on 5 continents around the world, who's serving, major corporation from Deutsche Bank in Germany to Citibank in the US, my instincts, my skills are, I've never worked for a company as big as Red Hat is today, much less managed one. So while I continue to serve as a director of Red Hat, I continue to work with Matthew Zulik, their CEO. You'll have to ask the guys at Red Hat why you should choose Red Hat over, pick another, SUSE Linux or Mandrake, both of whom are good guys trying to make good products.
Well, let me ask it like this. Since you were the entrepreneur with Red Hat, How did you get the name and the marketability out there to the world? Because everyone internationally, if they've heard of Linux, they've heard of Red Hat.
Okay, well, here's actually the answer to that. And it does a little bit relate to where Red Hat, the value of Red Hat is today. But again, as I say, don't hold me to that. Check with Matthew Zulik over at Red Hat. The thing that we recognized early on, and this is a little bit because we had no money, so I was the only business guy at Red Hat. I was it. Everyone else at Red Hat were guys like Mark Ewing or Eric Troen or Donnie Barnes. Later on, guys like Alan Cox. These are all sort of long-haired, hippie programmer types, all of whom have an IQ of 2 or 3 times mine. So when they told me that, they'd support me at trying to build Red Hat into a corporation, but what I couldn't lose sight of was that the unique benefit that open source represented was that it gave the engineers control over the technology, and that's why they wanted to work in the open source space. Because of that commitment, they held me accountable. So Red Hat's brand, from the very earliest day, our brand commitment is that every line of code we distribute under an open source license. And it's because of that brand acknowledgement, it's because every engineer everywhere understands that Red Hat is committed to making them successful because we distribute all of our software. This isn't about better, faster, or cheaper software. This is about software that you, the engineer, for the first time, have absolute control over. So we don't wrap proprietary tools into Red Hat. We don't force you to sign a licensing deal just to get the software. We treat you as a partner in the development of this technology, and it is that brand statement. It is associating Red Hat with the core value proposition of open source, in my opinion, that has made Red Hat very successful.
Red Hat was the first distro to list. Why did they list?
The first is arguably incorrect. The guys at Caldera, Ransom Love and Brian Sparks, were first-class guys working very hard at making Caldera successful. They raised a big chunk of money. They were arguably, in fact, the first open source company to raise a significant amount of money, although that title could go to Cygnus Solutions, the C and C++ compiler guys, who eventually merged with Red Hat because they raised some venture capital early on. And then the guys in SUSE in Germany also raised capital. The reason you have to raise capital as a technology company is Geoffrey Moore's famous book about crossing the chasm. It requires a lot of effort, a lot of resources to move your innovative technology from the early adopter market, the long-haired programmers who really understand the technology, the Alan Coxes and Eric Troens, into the mainstream and convince the MIS director for Deutsche Bank or the MIS director for De Beers down in your neck of the woods to commit the future of their organization to technology from a little company in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. They just aren't going to do it unless they believe that that little company is going to be around 5, 10, 15 years into the future. So by having a big successful stock market offering, by raising a couple of $100 million, we are able to go into the MIS director at De Beers and he'll take us seriously, whereas the day before we did that, when we were a $14 million box software vendor, he wouldn't have returned our phone calls.
How does an end user choose the right distro?
Well, that's both the strength and the weakness of open source. But it is arguably, interesting enough, the strength or weakness of the free market system. So you can say, well, the old Russian Marxist system was really easy. If you wanted a toaster, you went to the state company and you bought the toaster. And there was none of this confusion in the marketplace. There was none of this, what if you bought the wrong toaster and it was really a bad one compared to a good toaster? And how do you choose a good toaster? Well, you don't get people complaining about the free market system. We've come to understand that choice is a good thing for consumers. There's actually much less confusion in the Linux distribution business than it appears on the surface of it. I've heard people claim there's 200 Linux distributions. There's actually only 4 or 5 that you as a